Welcome everybody to the Community Technical Assistance Center of New York. Our webinar for today is the supervisor's role in promoting data-guided decision-making. Before we get started, just wanted to do a little bit of housekeeping. Currently, everybody is muted. Just in case, please go ahead and mute your own phones or computer speakers, especially if there's any interference. The slides and the recording for today's webinar will be posted on our ctechny.org website within 1 to 2 days. Since everybody's muted, you can communicate with us through the chat box. If you don't see the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen, you can hover over the bottom of where the slides are, and there's a little chat bubble. You click that, and the chat box should open on the right-hand side. When you send messages to us, comments, feedback, questions, make sure to hit send to all panelists in the dropdown. At the end of the webinar, there will be a feedback survey that pops up. Please make sure to complete that. Take a minute or two to do that, as we do appreciate your feedback and look forward to reading it after every webinar. There will be a Q&A period at the end of the webinar, so we may hold some of your questions for the end of the webinar as well. So without further ado, I'll introduce Dr. Tony Salerno, of which many of you may already be familiar with, as he's been spearheading the Supervision webinar series. Dr. Salerno is an Innovation and Implementation Officer at the McSilver Institute and a licensed psychologist with over 30 years of public mental health experience in adult inpatient and outpatient settings. Welcome, Tony.
Thanks so much, Lydia. And welcome all of you out there, all the supervisors, to a topic really that is at times particularly challenging, this whole area of like data. Actually, I got to be very involved with data when I was working inpatient. I was director of rehab services, but the director of quality assurance had passed away unexpectedly. And I was asked to kind of assume that role during a Joint Commission accreditation. And the use of data became like a critical piece for me. And I have to say, I was initially pretty uncomfortable with it, but I really began to understand and recognize how I was able to make, I think, more informed decisions, better decisions, when I was able to have data that was reliable and really valid and available to me. And I know that in my supervisory roles, I often really didn't have that much really hard data. A lot of it was just, kind of anecdotal, or a lot of decisions that we make that may not be really guided by having some hard information. So today's focus is really on that. My hope is to just give you guys a broad overview of this particular topic area in the next hour or so. And hopefully there would be at least one idea that comes out of this that you guys can actually kind of move forward in a way that's going to be more professionally satisfying and really help you to be a little more successful in your role. So looking at this, because this has to do with decision making. It's not like data for data's sake. It has to do with its contribution to making important decisions. And you guys, in a role of a supervisor, are having important decisions to make, and the degree to which data supports that. How to drive quality, because ultimately that's the whole point of all of this. And then there are really different types of data. There's process and outcome kind of like data, and it's important to sort of recognize what the differences are. And then really the primacy of the client's like self-report. And then how do you represent data? And I'll talk a little bit about some sort of data-related tools that could be of some use to you guys, as well. So the first thing is like, how the heck do we make decisions? So when we have instruction, directive, mandates from senior level leadership, right? That's how you might make a decision. Why do you do what you're doing? Well, somebody told me to do it. Right? Sometimes there's governmental authorities, there's the payers who are involved. There's a lot of forces out there that are kind of pushing us to make some decisions about how we do business in our work. And sometimes we just have no choice, maybe on how to fulfill a particular, sort of directive. And then, of course, we sometimes make decisions, and I certainly have, is on my own kind of like the way I thought about things, right? I'll call it a bias, meaning it doesn't have really much data behind it. It's just that it feels right to me, or it aligns with my perspective or my belief system, right? Or my attitudes or my values. And it's whatever feels right to us based on our own kind of personality. Now, I think this quote by Anais Nin is important. Out of all the different quotes that I've come across, this one kind of stuck with me because I think it says something like really important, is that we don't see things as they are, but as we are, which really means is to always be attentive to the way in which we see reality, basically, what's out there, is through our lens, and our lens of our experiences, our emotional states, really everything that goes into making us as the human beings that we are. And it's sort of like really important because sometimes we may think we're really seeing things as they are, when actually we're seeing things as we are, meaning through our own particular lens. Data can sometimes help us to get out of the kind of like biases that just is part of human nature. And I think that's an important consideration. Hope I went a little bit fast here. Okay, so how do we make decisions? Now, sometimes you might just you have experts, right? Consultants. You ask people that you trust. Some folks go to the literature. They say, what does science have to do with anything here? What I remember from my training and my professors, sometimes you were, kind of socialized in a certain kind of a point of view, depending on your own educational experience and those who've influenced you. What we've been doing that seems okay. It's like, I guess we'll continue doing what we're doing. It's just based upon like the current status. Also, sometimes we make decisions based on what our team members think, what your boss wants to hear. Sometimes we ask our friends or family if there's a decision that's related to something that they know something about. Find out what your account, you may find out, like, so what are other people doing? What are other supervisors doing in the same organization or in different organizations? Maybe we'll go to a webinar, right? Like this one, right? And then sometimes we make decisions where data plays a role in those decisions. And that's really what this is about. So high performance teams, they do pay attention. If there's a definition, and maybe some of you are on the webinar related to high performance teams and team building, is that one characteristic of really highly effective teams is that they pay attention to results. And part of that is that we have information that tells us what our results are. If that's a missing ingredient in any team, that reduces that team's ability to really perform at its optimum level. So how do we have a way of knowing how we're doing? Are we able to keep track of important outcomes? Do we keep track of our accomplishments in areas that have not been, as successful as we would have wanted? What are the important outcomes? How will we know? Who decides? Do we regularly review our goals and progress in a way that is specific and also measurable? Do we express dissatisfaction with data that falls short of our expectations and goals? Right? Do team members discuss areas of improvement that they are concerned about? That's the kinds of things that if you answer yes to all of these, right, or to many of them, or there's a number of them, that's characteristic of a high-performance team. So use of data is also an indicator of how well a team is able to accomplish its goals. So if you don't pay attention, right, if the team leader or the supervisor doesn't attend to results or outcome, it communicates that it doesn't really matter. That information, data, we can kind of go on our impressions and our sort of like anecdotal experiences, and that's good enough. And it becomes difficult then to hold people accountable for behavior that detracts from those goals. Let me make a point about this last one. We've heard from a lot of supervisors that they would like a webinar on having those difficult or hard conversations with employees or with supervisees. So just to let you know, our next webinar in July is going to be focusing on that, is how to have those hard, difficult conversations. And let me tell you, they were difficult for me, and they're difficult for folks who are in a position of leadership. And so I just want to let you know that. But so there's a relationship between the use of data and having those hard conversations. It's really tough to hold people accountable, right, with respect to whatever kind of behavior that detracts from the mission and the goals and the aims of your particular program. And data can oftentimes help us to have those conversations more, to be really more productive. So it's kind of an emotional, this area, in terms, where are you? For some folks, and at various points, I was kind of one of these boxes, right? One is like, I just distrust the data and avoid using it. I see this data here. I don't know what it means. All it is numbers to me. Part of that is data needs to be translated into information. When data has the meaning behind the data and that you can act upon the data, now you got information. So data just kind of like sits there with these numbers and like, what am I supposed to do about this? And for some, it's like, forget it. I just distrust it and I avoid it altogether. For others, is I don't really care about data and I have no need really for it. I'm kind of like indifferent to it. The decisions I need to make is going to be based upon all those other things I mentioned in a few slides back, rather than having some hard, data to base my decisions. And then there are folks who are data informed, right? You use it only when it supports your opinions and decisions. This is very common. The data is fine as long as it aligns with my perspective. And if it doesn't, it's not that important. My perspective always wins out. And then there are folks who really use it. It shapes and informs much of their decisions. Whenever there's data available, it is accessed and it is utilized to make some decisions. So you can think about where you kind of like fall on this, and at various points, sometimes you can go through a number of these. But there's also limitations, so let's just recognize that as well. There are many, many times we have to make decisions that are really driven more by values, that are driven by ethics, that are driven by moral standards, that are driven by common sense. And we may not have the data. We'd like it, but we may not have it available. So as Einstein points out, not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts. We cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them. So I just want to sort of like recognize, I'm not trying to poo-poo decisions that are based upon values, that is based upon, sometimes it just seems like common sense, that is based upon some practical considerations. But when there's data that is available, it can be part of the formula to making decisions that are most informed as possible. So I have a couple of poll questions for you guys, just to get a sense of where you are with this. So in this poll question, the question is, how often does data play a major role in the decisions that you make? And would you say, really pretty much all the time, or much of the time, sometimes, to be honest, Tony, not that much. All right, so just think about in your day-to-day decisions that you make, how often does data play a role in your decisions? Just give you guys a moment. Okay, just another moment. Takes a little bit for the WebEx system to kind of tabulate all your responses. Let's see. Connor, how are we doing? Okay. So a small number say all the time. A large number says much of the time. About 104 out of the 400 we have. Sometimes, and as it turns out, no one said not much. So there's some role of data. For very few, it's like plays a role all the time. But for other larger numbers, much of the time, and then a large number, which sometimes it plays a role. Great. So we have really a spectrum of responses to that. Now I have another poll question for you. What best describes your access to data to make decisions as a supervisor? This is a really important issue as well. Do you have access to all the data that you need, right, to make the most optimal decisions? Do you have much of it? You have some of it, just a little, or tell you the truth, Tony, I got none. I have so little access to data to help me in improving the quality of our services. So where would you guys be with that? Give you a moment. Yeah, we'll be just a little patient here. I think we have a very large number of folks who are on, so it's going to take a little bit of time to get the responses. Okay, great. So again, a smaller number having access to all. Those 23 folks. Much of the data. I have some of the data. The majority have some of the data. Just a little. And thankfully, no one says, I have absolutely no data that would help me to kind of make decisions. Thank you so much, everyone. So we can see that people really are on a whole continuum of both using data and having access to data. And in the chat box, this is the question I would want to ask you guys. So when you think of it, what kind of data would you most want to have that is just really difficult to get, or that you just don't have available? What kind of data would be so valued by you as a supervisor that would be so helpful in your role? If you can just spend a moment just thinking about that. Gee, what would I really like to have available to me that I just don't have, or it's so difficult to get that I don't get it? So if you guys would just chat that in, and we're just going to kind of get a sense of what people are thinking about in terms of, data and information that they would really like to have. Okay, so we can see on the chat box, we should be getting folks just type it into the chat. Give you guys like a moment. Okay, and get more data from supervisees that they are reluctant to provide. Aggregate data determine the program's progress. Thank you, Yvette. Okay, a lot is coming in. I can't see them all. Are they all on, should be on the right side, Connor?
Yeah. Yes, they're all there. So getting sort of access to better quality data, looking at longer term outcomes.
I see.
Client satisfaction and barriers, obstacles to service. Better aggregation and measurement of family outcomes would be helpful, is some of the feedback coming in. Or looking at staff time and how staff are using their time. Right. Another one. Looking at outcome data.
Mm-hmm.
Amount of time spent on documentation and completing forms. Those are the sort of general themes.
Yeah, there's a lot going in there, and that really is an issue, right? And that can certainly be a focus of some of your efforts in the future to think about how you can get that kind of information. And is there a forum for you in your organization where people talk about that, where you get a chance to share with, because you're likely to need some leadership support in order to get some of that kind of like information. But it's important to identify it. And then why is that information important to you? What are the likely benefits of having that kind of information? Because it's going to take time, it's going to take energy, to do that. And that's one of the barriers, of course, is like, okay, listen, we're working here at full steam. How do we now engage in a process to gather that information? And everything you guys have listed here, I can see as being so critically important to make so many different types of decisions, which is terrific. And so what I'm going to share with you is, some ways of looking at data that might, again, be helpful, maybe even being able to make the argument in your organization to have access to this sort of data. So the purpose, of course, this is the strongest argument, is that it's always about like quality, right? And so when we talk about quality, we're talking about improved safety. What kind of information and data is needed so that we know that we are improving and people find this environment and program safe, that we have efficiency. A lot of you guys mentioned issues around efficiency and cost management, coordination of services, the integration of services, equity, which is another whole issue of whether or not in our program that everybody counts, that we have set of procedures and policies and practices that is accessible to everyone, that we don't unintentionally exclude folks because of the way we kind of set up our system. The efficacy, is this working? How do we know that all of our time and effort that we put into the work with our clients is really paying off? What way are they making progress? Are we doing things in a timely way or wasting a lot of time and energy? Do we have continuity, appropriateness, access? There's a lot of these indicators. And actually, the stuff you guys chatted in really relates to one or more of these particular indicators. That's the major argument, right? Of let's select which kinds of information, because it's going to take time and energy to do it, is likely to give us the biggest bang for the buck in terms of quality. And so major goal of data, one of the things I want to sort of suggest to folks is Do you know your population? That is like one critical thing. And I have to admit, I've run a lot of programs and all. We didn't do this. We just, I know we had to fill it out, and somebody up in central office probably had some of this information. But one of the questions is, do you know your population? Do you have a sense of the distribution of gender, religion, ethnicity, race, diagnoses, right? Education, current and medication history, age, ACEs score. If some of you are looking into the area of trauma, whether it's a trauma score or it's another kind of instrument or screening instrument, to get a sense of the degree to which our clients have experienced significant adversity in their lives. How about, do we have any measure on their resilience or strengths? What about their residential situation, income and resource sufficiency? Do we even know who runs out of money right before the end of the month? That used to be one of my questions for all my clients is, you know, what point in the month do you run out of money? And I would say the vast majority could tell me, usually within the last week. Some ran out even faster than that. Substance use, chronic health conditions, retention and treatment, right, which some of you may already have, services that they're actually receiving, employment status, degree of loneliness, right? And then you could probably add some other things. So one question around the issue of data, do we know our customers? Do we know them? Do we have a sense of who they are? And in a way that develops a profile of the clients in your particular program. And that could be eye-opening in and of itself if you're able to gather that kind of information. So that would be just something that almost might be basic data in any organization. You know, in corporations, they spend a lot of time figuring out who their clients and customers are, right? They tremendous expense just to know who is it that is served and who is it that we want to serve. Now, the issue of performance indicators, which is a really important, how do you know you're doing a good job, right? Just how do you know? Using data to understand a process, a function, or a result, and using data to find problems and measure improvement. So that's one of the things about data, right? It's hard to change what you can't measure. It just is. It's hard to know what you're doing without data. It's hard to get others to change. And it's hard to understand the parts of the system that need to change without data and information. So you have a good sense of like, what should we keep doing? What do we got to like stop doing? And what do we have to begin doing, right? And it's really only data that can give you some very clear examples of, you know, what to do. At least it helps a great deal. Sometimes you don't have the data, you have to make these decisions anyway. Now, let me just share with you Dr. Salerno's not so terrific response to a question early on it. So I ran a day hospital for about 10 years. And so people, you know, we'd have people come in everywhere from commissioners and other, you know, big wigs from the hospital. This is an outpatient program of a larger hospital. And my answer was often like, well, we're doing pretty good because nothing bad has happened in over a week, right? Staff is showing up, clients are showing up, no major disasters. I deserve a raise. So that was not a stellar moment, I would say, in my response to, you know, how you doing? I had no data. I had like no information. We didn't have a setup in place. It wasn't even expected of us. It wasn't like put on the priority in terms of, you know, gee, what is it that we can measure that would give us a good indication of whether or not we're meeting our goals, who we meeting those goals for, who we not meeting goals for? Do we know who's sticking in treatment? Do we collect it in any kind of way? No, pretty much it was data that existed in the heads of practitioners, the people I supervised. And it isn't like we made lousy decisions like all the time. We just made a lot of decisions that were not informed. Let's put it that way. They were just not informed as well as they could have been informed. And so I just wanted to share that with you because at some point in time, you kind of look at just as long as bad things don't happen, the absence of negative things seems to be like really great. And I think, of course, we can do a heck of a lot better than I did at that point. So I just want to also share with you when you're thinking about data and how does this relate to performance indicators. There are really processes and there's outcomes, right? So the process, data related to your process is what do you do to achieve your ultimate and critical outcomes? Like all the stuff that goes the input, right? The outcomes is like what the heck really matters? What's the final most desired goal, right? The purpose of this, all of this. What's ultimately how we indicate, gee, we really accomplished what was the major goal? And that really has to do with, patient-specific outcomes. There's quantitative data, numbers you got, but there's also qualitative data, the stuff that you get from focus groups or interviews or kind of like surveys involving like written feedback. That's where you're getting really a conversation to bring some meaning to the data. So data could be like a bunch of numbers. And if you want to really understand what's behind those numbers, oftentimes you need to go to qualitative data. So the types of data, just giving you a sort of 2 by 2 here. You have outcome and process on the left side, quantitative and qualitative. So if you were looking at the number of people who stopped smoking, right? You just do that. Now, I was part of a national project with the work I do in D.C. on integrated care. And this is a $250 million project over 10 years. And it had to do with helping organizations integrate care. And one of the areas was smoking. And I can't tell you how difficult it was to just get folks to answer a simple question, right? How many people in your program smoke? Let's say it's 100. How many of those folks want to stop smoking? Let's say it's 65. How many of those folks actually attended any of your programs to address smoking? 22. Of those folks who attended 22, how many of them stopped smoking for at least 6 months? I don't know. So that whole process of being able to answer that question, so you would think that it would be something that's pretty simple, but I don't want to underestimate that really getting valid, reliable data is not always so easy to do. But if you were looking at number of days a person is homeless, percent of hospitalizations per 100 patients, those are quantitative, right? Qualitative outcomes, how confident clients are that they will prevent relapse, what clients believe has been most helpful, staff view of the evidence-based practice. So these are perceptions, and client perceptions of improvement is not inconsequential. That's like critical, right? That's a qualitative, right? Then there's processes, the number of people that you screen for substance use during an intake. And that's a number, right? Attendance data, turnover data. But the goal is not to get people to come to your program. The goal is not to reduce turnover. The goal is not to just reduce time from intake to treatment. The goal is that those things, right, add to what the ultimate outcome is, which is the progress that clients make on addressing the critical problems that brought them into treatment to begin with. Okay, so I just wanted to give you a kind of sense if you were kind of struggling with, well, what are some of the differences between outcome and process and quantitative and qualitative? This is sort of like a framework to collect all of that kind of data. The performance indicators, right? So monitor and track the degree to which you're implementing your improvement plan. So if you guys were interested in doing evidence-based practices, the question that you would ask is, well, are we doing it? How do we know we're actually providing a practice that meets certain kinds of like criteria, like these fidelity kind of criteria? How do we know? So many programs will tell me, oh, yes, we have evidence-based practices. Oh, yes, we do motivational interviewing. The question is, well, how do you know? You've got people trained in motivational interviewing. You got people who attended a workshop on a particular treatment program. You have a manual that people have in their disposal. How do you know that folks are actually doing it, implementing it in the way that they were trained to do? So practice fidelity is that example, and then monitoring that progress as well. Okay, another process indicator, implementation of a trauma screening process. Many organizations are very interested these days in just ensuring that they really have a conversation with their clients about screening for adversity in their lives. So a quantitative would be trauma screening implemented at a specific time, place, and person, like the number or percentage of folks who had that, the total number of clients screened per day, the percentage or number who screen positive, the ones who screen negative, and what do those things mean, right? But you have that in the screen. Qualitative would be, has anyone talked to the clients about how that process was? So, gee, Mrs. Jones, we just, had this conversation about adversity that's happened in your life. You filled out this particular screening. What was that like for you? How did you feel about that? Was it difficult to answer some of these questions? Did you feel comfortable answering these questions at this particular time? Those are all qualitative data. Very important, powerful data, right, around a process, like how we do business here, right? And then you can talk about this, how was it for the staff to actually engage the client in that process? And then feedback regarding how, did you know what you were supposed to do? what was based on the time demands, the burden of it. That's all from the staff's perspective, right? But you can also apply to the client's perspective. That's a qualitative data. And whenever you're thinking about trying to use data in order to monitor a process, those are the considerations. A quantitative implementation of a trauma-related assessment, right? Total number of clients who screen positive who receive a more in-depth assessment. So who is that, right? So we screened for 100 people. 37 had significant kind of adversity. For those, we did 22, we actually did a more in-depth assessment. And that showed that, yes, this is a serious clinical issue to address, right? Qualitative, again, is the response of the client, feedback from the staff. Intervention to address trauma. Quantitative, total number of clients who agree and attend individual group trauma-specific service of some sort. You know, how many was that? And again, when I work with organizations, you know, mostly in integrated care, who are doing some of these things, being able to answer that would be so powerful in being able to make important decisions, and also whether or not we're on the right track. So you say, yeah, you know, we screened and we have 18 clients who screened really positive, meaning positive that they had a lot of adversity. 10 of them had really serious, almost PTSD level types of like symptoms. And we have a treatment that we put in place. How many people are showing up? 2 people, right? So that just kind of says to you, okay, you know, that data tells you whether you have a problem that needs to be solved or that you're really making progress in the way that you want. And the qualitative responses, again, are similar to, again, it's just talking to people, right? Outcomes, the quantitative examples, right? So this is like stuff you can really put numbers to, and you feel it's really concrete. So if you're working with the area of physical health, which a lot of organizations are increasingly, you know, having integrated kind of care or using physical exams, or at least trying to collect data from primary care providers. So those mechanical indicators, blood pressure, weight circumference, all that kind of stuff, blood chemistry. Some of you are using PHQ-9 scores. Some are using ACEs type scores. Others are using some psychological improvement score, a goal attainment score, an outcome questionnaire, those sorts of like approaches that have like numbers attached to it, right? And then you have qualitative examples. Again, it's always around response and feedback from clients and from practitioners. Will there be a need for data? Let me just go back one moment, please. Okay, I gave you that. All right. I just wanted to say, just to raise this issue. I've been hearing a lot about post-COVID-19 that we have to sort of reimagine, right? Reimagining healthcare, reimagining behavioral health services. People are just sort of anticipating that this experience will have a significant change, impact really on how we go forward with our service system. There's a lot of talk about that, right? So in what way can data help? What do you need to know, right? So some of the information that might be helpful to kind of understand what the COVID-19 impact has had and how it might affect how we go forward. Percent of missed appointments, kept appointments compared to pre-COVID-19. That's kind of like pretty important. You know, so I certainly have heard from organizations where they've had very few missed appointments because people are at home, right? And we're calling them. The productivity seems to have increased, missed appointments decreased, but it might be interesting to know exactly what those numbers are. Percent of clients who prefer virtual appointments. Percent of clients living alone with little to no social connections. That's like a real important like indicator. How many of these clients that we're talking to, is there anyone else at the home? How distant are they or disconnected from other people? Percent of clients requiring emergency psychiatric care. Has there been an increase in referrals compared to pre-COVID-19? So there's a whole set of information and data that organizations may think about addressing as they begin to think about how we reimagine services in the future. Okay, the importance of self-report. I just want to get to this particular piece around the patient-centered care. Now, this is another quote, which I think is important, from Don Berwick, who was the head of CMS at one point, and was the originator of the Institute for Healthcare Improvement. The ultimate judge of the quality of our work is the patient, end of story. So some may agree, some may disagree with that. But I just want to kind of encourage, and if I was thinking about the programs that I was running throughout my career, that would have been one of the most critical things, is what's the client say about our program? What does the client say about improvement in their lives? What does the client say about increased success and satisfaction in role areas that are important to them? What do people say about the things that really matter to them and the degree to which our services help them to make progress towards those particular goals? That's sort of like, in a way, the ultimate judge. All the thing about timeliness, coordination, continuity, presumably those are in the service of improving the experience of the client's life, right? Their experience of care and their experience of making improvements into the success and the satisfaction that they experience. So patient outcome, the patient's view of their physical behavioral health, sometimes not always addressed outside of, like, in clinical trials, they do a lot of work on that. But in terms of routine kind of services, maybe not so much. Maybe you guys are doing much better at that, and that's fantastic. Yet the ultimate measure really is whether people recover from an acute or chronic health condition, behavioral health, persistent problems, substance use, or negative impact of adverse life experiences. They make progress towards personally meaningful goals, and the person's report of one's perception experience is a critical gauge of success. So if I was to ask you, you have any way of knowing and tracking and aggregating data on how your clients are doing, meaning that they've making progress in the way that they want to make some progress? Do you have any data on that whatsoever? Do you have any data on people who said they wanted to work and are now working, or people who said that they wanted to have their own independent living situation and now have an independent living situation? People want to go back to school and now going back to school. That's the kind of thing that really should have been asked of me when I was running a day program. That would have been really the critical things. How many people wanted to work who actually got a job, education, or living situation, or social situation, or relationships, or many different things that could have been indicators that this program is moving folks along. Sometimes we focused on the client coming to the program as the indicator, right? If you came 2 days a week, but then you came 3 or 4 days a week, like sort of the more you adapted to our expectations in the program, that meant that you were doing better, right? And I think hopefully, we have gone beyond that. This is going back into the 80s, where I think we weren't as attuned to the issues of, like, recovery. Okay. So there was some discussions. I'm not sure how far this has gotten, but it may regenerate itself again. The patient, sort of reported outcome measure. That's what PROM means. Early stages of development for clinical practice. They have been mostly used to monitor conditions that rely on patient reports, such as depression. And there was a hope that the electronic records would really be able to capture the clients, right, the patient's reported outcomes. So there was a lot of interest in that. There was some work in the United States. We don't know to what degree that's going to sort of reemerge again, both for managed care, for those who are paying, for regulatory licensing, is the degree to which we capture patient report of positive progress in their lives. So I just want to make that point, because ultimately, out of all the kind of data that we collect, that may in fact be the most important. Now, I want to go on to, like, related to that, displaying some data and personal dashboards, population health measures, and process indicators. Just give me a moment. Okay, so this is an example. This when I was doing some work, mostly on integrated care. So this is what they would do. Some organizations, they would create a dashboard for each patient, each client that they had. And, this had to do with physical health indicators, but you could have those categories having to do with psychological, substance use. You just all the behavioral health related types of, like, indicators. And they would kind of show the client, like, where they were in the beginning, right? Maybe at intake, baseline, where they were at 6 months, where they were at 12 months. This notion of having a dashboard that your client and you use to actually monitor and graphically or in a table show progress, that's, like, really very, very powerful. Because it's clients getting feedback on areas where they're doing well, areas where they may be struggling or they're stuck, or areas that may not be going as well, maybe going backwards. That is part of information, not just for you, not just for the organization, but the use of data for the client so that they can use that information to make more informed decisions. That is a very high level of using data. And I've seen organizations where they have a individualized dashboard for each of their clients. And they monitor, it could be just 2 or 3 key indicators. And they just monitor it, let's say every 6 months, every 3 months. It depends, whatever interval you want. But it's shared with the client so that the client also can see the degree to which they're making some improvements in some areas, places where they're staying the same, and places where they may be going backwards. That self-monitoring is part of good clinical care, both in behavioral health and primary care. So I don't know to what degree any of you will have the capacity, capability, but that's a very high level use of data when it's something that is collaboratively used with your client. This is population. You know, let's say for 100 clients that you have, I don't know if any of you guys are able to generate these types of graphs. This is an example with some physical health indicators, right? And you can see every 3 months where things are. If you have, like, I'm just using 100 clients, that would be a tracking. So if I went to an organization, your organization, I said, you do any kind of tracking aggregate on your clients related to some key indicators around progress? And if you showed me something like this or something like this, which has to do with positive mood or employment or medication adherence or any other kind of behavioral health related type of issue, that's high level. And that does give you an idea of whether or not you're moving in the right direction and who you're moving in the right direction for. This is just an example of a program, Whole Health Clinical Group, which basically wants to have a picture, right, of the key indicators in their program. Satisfaction levels, right, feedback, referrals, attendance, right, all this sort of thing that gives an organization sort of a picture of their own profile around certain kinds of indicators. Again, another very high level use of like data that the team can share, the organization can share. Maybe some of you do it, maybe some of you don't, but maybe some of you might say, you know, that's not such a bad idea. Maybe that's an area that we could begin to think about, how we take the critical indicators in our program and really just put them on a sort of a graphic representation, displaying data in a way that makes sense, that gives you a lot of information and that everyone can kind of look at over a period of like time, can again give you, hey, wow, I'm so pleased that we're moving in this direction, but it looks like this other place isn't going anywhere. So it gives folks a chance to kind of address problems and to improve, quality as you go along. Again, these are just some of the examples. We could spend half an hour just going through a diagnosis of an analysis of this particular scale. So part of it is your capacity to collect data, but there's a lot of challenges. I get that. Exchange information, monitor population health, and your capability. You know, your electronic health record, what kinds of reports it can spit out for you, and does the organization have a reliable system for collecting the data and supports for aggregation? And so there's just a recognition of some of the challenges associated with it. Just didn't want you guys to get the attitude or belief that somehow we aren't recognizing. I understand these challenges probably as well as anyone does, but sometimes you have to say, okay, we recognize the challenges, but maybe we can find some space for some collection of information that's going to be practical for us, that will not overwhelm us in terms of time and energy, and still meaningful, that can help us to kind of move forward. That's really the question. Now, some of you involved in continuous quality improvement, and data certainly can be helpful. So here's an example. So I don't know how many folks might think this way. I had to do a lot of this when I was director of rehab services in a large hospital. So we have relapse rates, hospitalization, emergency visits, missed appointments. Let's say, any of these things, right? Negative incidents, days homeless, you name it, right? Where scores that are lower are better, right? Higher scores are worse. So you're saying, okay, this is our program. This is how we do things. This is the number of missed appointments. We're hovering in this kind of like area, right? So people can just say, okay, that sounds fine to me. That's just the way things are, right? Okay, so that's now, now all of a sudden, something happened, right? This is the deviation approach to change. Oh, what happened here? Hold on, we're not just moseying along. We've increased unemployment rates, the dropouts, the negative incidents, the missed appointments, the days homeless, burnout, compassion fatigue. What's going on over here? That's usually what gets an organization's attention, what gets a program's attention, right? That's very, very common way in which people decide to improve something, to take action, right? And then you study it and say, well, what's going on? And then you study it, you diagnose it, and you come up with some ideas to do something, and then you fix the problem. You say, we're back to where we were. That's great. We're moseying along like we were. We fixed the deviation. Now, sometimes change happens through benchmarking. You have our program, which is doing really well, and then their program. So basically, you say ha-ha to the other program, saying we're much better than you, and maybe you send them this chart because you want to show them that you guys are much better, and you feel like, wow, we're so much better than these other programs, and as long as we can kind of keep to where we are, we're doing great. That's the benchmarking, like comparing yourself to others, right? I just want to give you one idea around benchmarking. I did this presentation on turnover, and I just thought maybe you might be interested in taking a look at this. But this is the data on the turnover rate in New York State, 2015. Right? Turnover is how many people, percentage of people who leave within a year, whatever the time frame was in 2015. This is pretty high, right? From 28, 34 in different regions of New York State. And then vacancy, how many vacancies, percentage of unfilled staff positions, right? So that's just a sort of an example. So if you were in a program, let's say in Hudson River region, and your turnover rate was like 21%, you say, aha, we are so much better than those other programs. We're so much better than the average that's going on. That's one way of like sort of thinking about, are we doing okay or not doing okay, right? That's a common thing. Now, if it's the other way around, the other program is doing better than we are, then, of course, we say things like they have a different population, we have more serious clients that we work with, we have a much more challenging kind of community, all the sorts of things, right, that we, in order to say we're really not doing that bad, right? Okay. So that's benchmarking. Now, in real quality improvement approaches, if you understand data from not so much a benchmarking or deviation, the proactive approach, this is very high level performance. So you're watching all of this going on, right? And instead of saying, let's wait for a deviation, or are we doing better or worse than others around us, what you do is you study the process, because you don't want people who want to be employed to not be employed. You don't want 20% of your population to have poor clinical outcomes. You don't want 20%, 15% of your staff turning over. You don't want 15% of your staff telling you that they're burnt out, right? That's not really the goal. So in a proactive approach, you study the process, and then you redesign the process. And then you improve the process. That's a very high-level continuous quality improvement. I know oftentimes organizations will say, okay, as long as we can do 80% of our clients feel safe in this program, that's a good number, right? And I've done that myself in quality improvement, where we set these 80% of this, 75% of that. And then in a way, what we're really saying is that for 25% of our clients, they could get really subpar service. They could get poor treatment. As long as we get 80% is okay, the other 20% we don't care about. Well, proactive approach is an every single person approach. It says, no, what we want is every client. No one doesn't matter here, right? So that's just something to really think about as you go forward. If you begin to collect data, if you adopt a proactive continuous quality improvement, you're not looking at deviation or benchmarking per se. You're kind of looking at how can we improve wherever we are now. How can we improve it? I don't care how others are doing. I don't care if, that we do just as well as long as you have no spikes in the wrong direction. What we care about is improving where we are. I wanted to share that with you because that's another way of like looking at data that could be helpful to you. The whole point of all of this, of course, is if you were charting things, displaying data, here are some, where are you now with kept appointments, percent of physical exams, percent of filled prescriptions. These are just examples. Trauma screening, compassion satisfaction, staff retention, all this kind of stuff. Your whole goal is to see if you can move the dot, right? You just want to move the dot. Sometimes it goes down, though. And so I wanted to just share that with you a little bit. It took me a long time to figure out how to do this dot movement. Okay. Starting with baseline perceptions of care again. This is where the client's perception is really important, starting with the baseline. Safety, comfort, friendliness, accessibility, choice, and involvement. Those are some really critical engagement issues. Some of you actually indicated that as some of the areas that you wish you had more data on client engagement, and this is very much directly related to client engagement. The degree to which clients are very committed to their treatment service relates to safety, comfort, friendliness, accessibility, choice, and involvement, and that's data you may be able to collect. Okay, I just want to give you another example of how a statewide organization can present that. This is on outcomes. Okay, so I'm going to go through this really quickly. We don't do this in New York State. In Utah, they do this, where each program does the same scale. They use the same outcome questionnaire. And my friends at Weber, who do tremendous work in supervision, are always in the top. They use the same standard questionnaire around outcomes, and they always seem to do better. Okay, so here are just some questionnaires. We're going to send you these slides. I just want to make sure we have time for questions around some outcome questionnaires, some samples that some of you may say, gee, it would be great if there was a standard outcome questionnaire that we can apply to all of our clients, and then we can use that as an indicator of a client's perception of improvement of care, making progress in their lives, and that we can actually compare our programs. That's where you can do a little benchmarking as well. But here's like a youth outcome questionnaire. Here's just a general questionnaire for adults. Now these are proprietary, but you'll be able to get some information if you wanted to look at, gee, I've heard this from organizations saying, I'd like a generic outcome questionnaire that I can apply across all clinical settings, all clinical conditions, all clinical type programs, just so that we can get a sense of a standardized way of getting an idea of where our clients are, at 3 to 6, 12-month intervals. So these might be helpful to you. They're the only few generic ones around. Here's one by Practitioner. If you wanted to know how your staff are doing, this is a very sensitive area because some supervisors really would want to know this. Sometimes you know it anyway, anecdotally, but here's a questionnaire that clients fill out on their practitioner. Very sensitive, I get it, right? And sometimes what you'll have is this kind of data. So you'll have, okay, Joe, or A is Anthony, this is his scores on customer service, or how many people missed appointments, or any one of these indicators here. I'm just using customer service. Well, Barbara, she has this level of customer service rating. Charles has this level, Donna has this level, and Eddie has that level. So that's when you're using data around performance of individual practitioners, of individual supervisees. It's a very sensitive area. Some organizations do it, very few. But again, it's a use of data as well. And I think I'm going to stop here because these are a little bit more sophisticated, and I want to give folks a chance to just mentioning some things around workflow and all. But I just want to leave some minutes for Q&A. And so we've got 5 minutes. And if folks want to type any questions in, and Connor or Lydia, any questions coming up?
Yeah, so yes, everyone, please go ahead and submit any questions that you may have. We have a couple minutes, so we can kind of touch on a few of those. We have been asked around slides. Yes, the slides in the recording will be posted on the ctacny.org website within 2 days. So someone asked if there are different uses of satisfaction surveys versus a validated tool to use during treatment to inform changes in treatment planning.
Yeah, I think the issue Satisfaction. But one of the things about satisfaction, in so many organizations who've used it, they always come out pretty high. So satisfaction is often the client telling you what they expected and what they kind of got. But sometimes people have low expectations. So you can be satisfied with things, get me a higher rating, but it would be a little different than if you ask people, I'm not interested so much in your satisfaction, but I want to know about your perception and your experience of care and actual things that have happened to you. So the idea that instead of asking, are you satisfied with how you get treated, the question might be, do you feel respected when you come to this particular program? Do people ask you if if the program or the service was helpful to you? It's more behavioral, right? Do you get treated in a friendly manner? When you have questions, do people take your questions seriously and work to give you an answer? That's a perception of care, an experience of care. I think the preference is for an experience of care survey as opposed to a satisfaction survey. And so I would recommend, and there are, if you just Google perceptions of care surveys, you'll get a number of different things, but that gets at, observable experiences rather than, are you satisfied with the program you get? Are you satisfied with the services available to you? It's very generic and less behavioral, and that means you're less able to actually act on that information.
Thanks, Tony. We have somebody from an addictions program who asked if you happen to be familiar with the brief situational confidence questionnaire.
Repeat that again, Lydia, I'm sorry.
Are you familiar with the brief situational confidence questionnaire?
No, I'm not familiar with that. So brief
situational confidence.
Situational. I'm not familiar with that. So I really have to comment on that one.
That's okay.
But I'm very curious about it, and I'm going to look. What I'm going to do is look it up right after this webinar to educate people about it.
How about boosting morale? Any thoughts around data related to boosting morale?
Yeah. Well, first of all, the use of data can be very helpful. The first thing is when you say you have a morale problem, I think the question is, well, what does that actually mean? Because I've yet actually to encounter many organizations who told me they didn't have a morale problem of some sort, right? So what do we mean by morale? And so if you were to actually administer, and some organizations I've worked with have done this, a measure, there's something called the ProQOL, P-R-O-Q-O-L, which is actually non-proprietary. And what it measures is the degree to which people experience burnout, the degree to which people experience compassion fatigue, and vicarious trauma. And it's a survey that one can administer and have staff complete. And I've worked with organizations who've done that, and they take that data and they begin to see the degree to which, somebody says there's poor morale. Well, how many people is that involved? Is it a handful of people? Is it everybody? Is it one program? Is it particular individuals who are very vocal? You have to kind of, what data gives is an answer to describing the problem, understanding the nature of the problem, the scope of the problem. So that would be just one example. It's very hard to tackle issues around general morale in an organization unless you go further and actually assess that. And there are instruments to assess morale. So data can be very useful. And I've seen it in a number of organizations who just said, we have to understand it. Now, if you wanted to go qualitative instead of quantitative, you would literally have focus groups. You would literally have supervisors who raise this issue to try to get a better understanding of the scope and the nature of people's dissatisfaction or disaffection, from work.
So let's do one last question before we wrap up. And I think it has to do with more about sort of the structure of data systems right now. So having data in multiple places and not having one data repository is a barrier to doing this.
Right.
Also, if an organization doesn't have a data analyst, for example, or somebody that can help cull this information is another barrier. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, those are resource kinds of issues. And I have no magic question or magic answer to a resource type of problem. The only thing I would suggest is you know, it's like, look, there's like the most optimal data that I'd love to have. There's data that's kind of pretty helpful, and there's data that's at least okay, or data that I can collect myself, or we as a team can collect that doesn't extend our demands on our time and our energy, that is still meaningful. I'm very big on, instead of like saying, look, forget it, it's just too hard, we don't have the resources, we don't have the data analysts, we're not going to, you know, it's like a pipe dream, right? That's one of, I actually felt that time, like that many a time. The other is, what data can we collect that is still meaningful? Modest, but meaningful, and it will give us at least some information about how we're doing, one area of quality that we can improve. So I think sometimes it's just accepting that there are some negative realities and finding some space where you can still be meaningfully involved in collecting data to improve quality.
Great, thank you, Tony. And with that, we'll wrap up our webinar. We have one more supervision webinar that we will announce for July on having difficult or challenging conversations with staff. So stay tuned for that. We have 2 additional webinars this week and next related to COVID around children's coping and grief and psychological first aid. And please feel free to check our website, cpacny.org, for additional resources. The webinar recording slides will be posted within 2 days on our website. Also, there will be a feedback survey that pops up at the end of the webinar. Please complete that as we do read all your information and comments. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful day, everybody. Thank you so much.
Stay well, everybody. Thanks so much for participating. Take care.